Hi, and welcome back to U.S. History with me, Mr. Snyder. And today we're going to wrap up our discussion of the Civil Rights Movement, talking about the late 60s and early 70s. So during the 50s and 60s, the Civil Rights Movement makes great strides forward. However, as we know today, racial injustice is not fully eradicated. Some African Americans become so frustrated with the situation that they turn to more radical and militant methods, and they go on to achieve further successes, but the radicalism of the times leaves a bitter legacy for America. So Freedom Summer happens because of CORE and SNCC. CORE, remembers, the Congress of Racial Equality. SNCC is the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, but they tend to shift a little bit more toward the violent side toward the end. But they register black voters in southern states because we're in the lower single digits of percentage of blacks in the South who are able to vote, especially in the Deep South, places like Mississippi and Alabama. Their goal is to gain attention to this voter discrimination, and hopefully Congress would pass a law prohibiting it, which does happen. During Freedom Summer, 3 civil rights workers disappear and are found murdered at a construction site. Other activists are beaten, fired from their jobs, and kicked out of their homes for taking part in Freedom Summer. So it wasn't just a volunteer. They really believed in the cause enough to lay their life on the line for it. So a political party forms out of Freedom Summer called the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, or the MFDP, and they want to be recognized as the state's legitimate Democratic Party, not the other one that appears racist. And so they travel to the 1964 Democratic Convention in New Jersey, and Fannie Lou Hamer gives powerful testimony about what happens to the SNCC members at Freedom Summer. And not a lot comes from this. The National Democratic Party agrees to seat some at-large delegates from this party, but that's not enough for them, and then it just kind of goes by the wayside. But it is a event in the road of civil rights. And so now we get to Bloody Sunday in Selma, Alabama. There was recently a movie about Selma. Very, very good movie. You should check it out. It's called Selma. But in 1965, a black man is shot for trying to vote, simply exercising his democratic right to vote. And so Martin Luther King, his Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and SNCC plan a 50-mile march to the capital of Montgomery. And they set out on March 7th, 1965, and they try to cross this bridge. And 600 marchers set out, and the state police stop them, and they tell them to turn back. And the state police form a line, and they just start walking and beating and tear gassing anybody who gets in their way. And this is known as Bloody Sunday. And so 3 weeks later, determined not to let them get the best of them, 3,000 marchers set out with federal protection. And along the way, this march grows to 25,000 people protesting these lack of civil rights. And then Congress takes notice of all of this action in the South and passes the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which the 2 main things that it does is it eliminates voter literacy tests, and it enables federal examiners to register voters. So usually states are in charge of registering their own voters, but in the South they're being discriminatory. So this allows federal people to register voters for the state. And we'll talk more about the Voting Rights Act and how it's been altered here in a little bit. And then also, during this time, we passed the 24th Amendment to the Constitution, which abolishes the poll tax. So you shouldn't have to pay to vote, which would disenfranchise some African Americans and whites in poverty from voting. So now you don't have to pay to vote. The government will front all the costs, and you should be able to vote for free. Race riots in the middle 60s. There's over 100 race riots in different cities around the nation, but the most famous ones are in Watts, which is in Los Angeles, Detroit, New York City, and Chicago. And President Johnson casts the Kerner Commission to determine the causes of the riots. So this is just a committee put together of politicians meant to investigate what is going on in these cities. And believe it or not, they figure out that long-term racial discrimination is the single most important cause of this violence, and people not being okay with it, not accepting it anymore. So they recommend some things that should be done, but if we do start spending federal money to close the wage gap and make the economic gap between poor and rich smaller, this is in fact like rewarding the rioters, so they're not going to do it. And the other point is that this ignores all other minorities besides the relations between black and white. Okay, so I told you some of these people are getting sick of the nonviolent route, and the lack of change, or the pace of change, is too slow for them, so they go to more militant means. And the first one up is Malcolm X. Here you can see Malcolm X. He's born, his name is Malcolm Little, but he changes his last name to X because he considers Little his slave name, and so did people in his group, the Nation of Islam. And he preaches black superiority over whites and separatism from whites. He's a follower of the Nation of Islam and Elijah Muhammad, the Nation of Islam's leader. He becomes like the rock star of the Nation of Islam and brings people to his cause. But toward the end of his life, he has a falling out with the Nation of Islam, actually goes to practice real Islam and not this radicalized version of it, and actually finds that Islam is a very peaceful religion, and that he travels to Mecca and prays alongside whites and shares food with whites and just has this really spiritual event, which you can see in his movie Malcolm X. And Denzel Washington, who I think looks very, very similar to this man here, Malcolm X. Denzel Washington plays him. And he is then killed, assassinated in 1965 by members of the Nation of Islam because he broke away from them and started his own organization. So think of Malcolm X as sort of the anti-Martin Luther King Jr., although toward the end of their lives, Malcolm X becomes more peaceful and Martin Luther King Jr. actually becomes a little more militant. The Nation of Islam, like I said, is led by Elijah Muhammad, and they're followers of the Islamic religion, although it's a radicalized version of it. They're also known as the Black Muslims. They believe in freedom, justice, and equality for blacks. They also don't allow any drugs or alcohol in their religion, so it is very, very strict. And they preach separatism from whites, or a separate society from whites. Stokely Carmichael is a former leader of SNCC, and he is not pleased with the pace of change. He also becomes involved with the Black Panthers, which we'll get to in a second, and he adheres to what is called Black Power, and he starts the Black Power movement. Black Power is not being ashamed of being black, but it's taking pride in being black and finding out where one comes from and finding out more about one's true heritage to levy social and political leadership. They collectively use that economic and political muscle to gain independence from whites. And some whites feel that this Black Power movement means black violence movement. And although Stokely Carmichael comes out and clarifies what he meant by Black Power, whites are still intimidated by this movement. The Black Panthers are another political militant group. Probably the most famous one, founded in the ghettos of Oakland, California by Huey Newton and Bobby Seale. And they become a symbol of young, militant African Americans who are pretty violent. They wear black leather and the caps, you can see the berets, and they openly display their loaded shotguns. They even enter the state capitol in Sacramento with their guns to protest the attempt to restrict their right to bear arms. But they also fight police brutality against blacks in the ghetto, and they create anti-poverty programs for blacks, and they give out free breakfasts for poor black children. So they are trying to help. They preach self-defense, which means if somebody attacks you, you don't have to take it. You have the right to defend yourself. And sold Mao Zedong writings, which you'll know is the leader of China, who is communist. And they are really the first group, along with Stokely Carmichael, to begin to refer to themselves as black instead of Negro or colored. In 1968, in Memphis, Tennessee, Martin Luther King Jr. unfortunately is assassinated on April 4th. Riots erupt at the news of this. How could somebody assassinate such a non-violent, peaceful man? And Robert Kennedy, John F. Kennedy's little brother, who was killed in 1963, he is making a speech in Indianapolis, and he actually prevents riots from breaking out in our capital of Indianapolis. But then on June 6th, Robert Kennedy is assassinated after he wins the California primary. And then in 1968, the Civil Rights Act of 1968 happens. This is a good thing. It ends discrimination in housing and strengthens already existing anti-lynching laws. So what were some successes of the movement? Well, the movement officially ends de jure segregation, which would be segregation by law in housing, schools, public facilities, etc. Thurgood Marshall, toward the end of the 60s, is a symbol of the progress made because he is appointed as the first black Supreme Court justice in 1967. And we also, toward the end of the 60s, get the Fair Housing Act, which bans discrimination in housing. Controversies, though, starting in the 1970s, the federal courts order that even if a district is de facto white, like they're just white because a lot of white people live there, like Carroll, federal courts required the use of forced busing to integrate neighborhoods and schools. So they would ship black students from neighboring cities into the district so that they were integrated. President Richard Nixon ordered an end to this practice. And then also affirmative action, which President Nixon was a proponent of, gives preferential treatment to minorities, whether it be race or gender, for positions and resources. So for jobs, for college scholarships, college admissions, some universities have affirmative action practices. Whites view it as reverse discrimination or reverse racism, and it remains controversial today, and it may have unintended consequences as well. So that is our discussion over the civil rights movement. We will touch more along it as we move on in U.S. history, but that is the main part of it. Fill out your learning targets, and I will see you later. Bye-bye.